ora e te whānau, welcome to another episode of Raw Politics. This is the podcast when us politics tragics here at Newsroom break down the bigger issues of the week and then try and throw forward, give you a little bit of insight into what to look out for next. As always, I am joined in Auckland by Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Kia ora.
And I should say, of course, that I am Laura Walters. I am Newsroom's political editor. Now, we've had a big couple of weeks, Tim. We had a historic apology last week, which we spoke about on Raw Politics. This week we had an historic hikoi. It seems like there's a lot going on here. I mean, do you feel overwhelmed by it, or do you think that people are really engaged with all of this, these big displays, this big politics, this depth of feeling that we're seeing across the country?
I don't feel overwhelmed. I think people recognise you get to sort of historic milestone points. We've had two in 2 weeks. The apology, you'd hope, has longer lasting ramifications than the bill, at least. The hīkoi might have short-term ramifications that will bring the bill to a rounded off close by about May, but I think the apology you'd see as having a longer tail in terms of what effects and improvements maybe are made.
Yeah, it will be something that will continue. It'll be a slow burn, won't it? And something that we will continue to keep an eye on. But of course, most of that will come next year because we're only a few weeks out from the summer break, thank goodness. Now, this week on Raw Politics, we will take a look at that hikoi that we saw at the start of this week. We'll have a look at, the history of it, how it places alongside other protests and how politicians responded to that and what comes next, of course. Then we will be patching in our colleague Mark Dalder all the way from the COP Summit, the COP Climate Summit in Azerbaijan. He's going to talk to us a bit about what he's seen there and what the summit hopes to achieve, as well as the performance from our Climate Minister Seymour. And to wrap up, as always, we will offer you some recommendations. Last week on Raw Politics, we talked about the fiery first reading of David Seymour's Treaty Principles Bill, and this week we saw tens of thousands of people march on Parliament in opposition to that bill and other policies that have been set down by this government. Now, Tim, we'll get into a little bit more depth around this hikoi, but I wanted to start by talking to you about the crowd count. We don't want a repeat of the Trump inauguration, 2017, I think it was. But, I mean, I'm interested in your take. How many people do you think were there? Do you have a best guess, and does it even matter?
I'm not good at analysing drone shots or even crowds, actually, when I've been in them and reporting in them over the years. But I'm helped by a doctoral mathematics student in Canada, a New Zealander, who did some mahi on this, got a video analyst. They worked out how many people were passing a certain point for how many minutes at what rate. He estimated that the minimum he could give this crowd will be 84,000.
Wow, that is significant, isn't it? Well above the latest police count, which I think was around 42,000.
Yeah, so that's double that, yeah. Now, you might say, well, someone might have gone back and rejoined the tail of that crowd and extended the videoing that he's doing it off. There could be all sorts of variables, but, this was very big. And these things, they can be shows of display, or they can be shows of force. I think it has some political force because of its scale and because of its peaceful nature, and the fact that it came for a purpose, achieved the purpose, and all kind of dissipated without any political downside, if you like.
Yeah, and we will get into the comparisons with other hikoi and protests later on in the episode. But I'm interested, just while we're on this kind of subtopic, if you will, what you thought of David Seymour kind of his effort to talk down the numbers, to say that, well, there are about 19,000 people out there and there are actually more at the Dunedin hospital protest recently. I thought that was an interesting tactic personally. They're protesting against us in Wellington, they're protesting against us in Dunedin. I wouldn't have thought that would be the thing he'd want to draw people's attention to. But, do you think that was a good strategy or a good tactic from him?
Seymour's interesting, isn't he? There's a case that could be made that this year that he could be a contender for Politician of the Year, in the sense of what he managed to get up and active and underway, what he managed to negotiate first a year ago, at the end of last year, but the fact that he's pushed on and been pushy about his party's policies and claiming credit for the government's measures that's brought in that he believes had their, a birth in ACT's policies in the past. He's been active, he's been clear, he's been dominant, probably, more than anyone other than probably the Prime Minister. But he can't kind of help himself. It seems to me that on this one, he's got the bill in, he's persuaded New Zealand First and National to get it this far. It's going to go to the Select Committee. He's had his speech. The haka brought it to a head last week. There was little he needed to do this week, really. Whatever happened with the hikoi, big, small, intense, or, if it had been hollow, he didn't need to do a lot. But he can't kind of help himself sometimes, I think. So he went out in a predetermined, he calls it facing the crowd. Of course, it was what most of us would have called gone out for a look from behind lines of policemen, just to have a quick sense of the thing. Films himself on social media, of course, and then after that has to kind of attempt to put the hīkoi down a bit to put himself up with this number game thing. Whatever number he'd picked, it would have been way low. And then, as you say, to try and compare it to another protest against something that not his party probably, but this government is being objected to down south, isn't particularly wise either. I think with Seymour, he and ACT, and by that I mean ACT's social media team, who I think must be quite callow and quite, excuse me being quite so dismissive, but they come across as quite immature at times with the caliber of the social media content they're putting out there, responding to taunting, trying to belittle. I think it doesn't serve them well. This party of, freedom and libertarian values and, the free market policies and getting things out of the way, and each to their own, is kind of the mantra. But they're not really letting people be to their own. If they're not accepting what they're saying, they're going after them. And Seymour betrays that a little bit as well, I think, and it's to his detriment probably. He's a pretty sharp character and he's done a lot. It doesn't need to be drawn back and into every squabble.
Yeah, and to your point, Tim, about what he's achieved, he's an incredibly hard worker, and he's tenacious. And so you've really got to hand it to him that. But I think that some of the actions and the responses, like you mentioned around the social media videos and response, it undermines, I think, what he says about wanting to have a genuine conversation about this as well. And you have to take him at his word on that he wants to start a mature conversation across the nation about the place of te tiriti in modern New Zealand. And just going out there and not facing the hikoi, not listening to what people have to say, but going out there in order to film that social media video. Yes, a conversation takes talking and listening, but on that day, he could have just listened. That's a really important part of politics, is listening to people. Whether you agree with them or not, you never know what you might hear from that will actually help you, help your cause, help win other people over, but to better understand what reservations they might have. So if he genuinely wanted to have a constructive debate, I think that he undermined it by the way that he responded on Tuesday. And going forwards as well, I think it was Peter Dunn who pointed out in his column for Newsroom that, he's got this, David Seymour has this 6-month select committee process now. Of course, the hikoi isn't the end of this. It will continue to go. It will continue to bubble away and flare up as well. And then as that finishes, he's due to take over the deputy premiership. So it's all quite nice timing that's lined up for him there. Do you think he can keep this momentum up? Do you think he can keep the focus on himself throughout this? And does that play well for him? Or do you think that more people might actually turn on him and it might not work to his favour?
I don't know that people will turn on him because he's probably got, a fair minority of support. We know he's got 8%. He might have double or triple that, maybe, directly on this particular issue. But beyond that, I think there is a danger, and it's a bit cyclical, really. It's a bit of the same danger that ACT faced in the early 2000s. Late 1900s, between about 1999 and 2003-4, when Rodney Hyde was about to assume to the top of ACT after Preble's time, and Hyde was into, perk busting and gimmicks, and eventually got called out by Roger Douglas that this is too far away from what we should be about as ACT. We should be about economic reform, freedoms principle, and the big ticket items that reshape and reframe how the economy and society works. I think ACT risks actually falling into the same trap of this is a great diversion from their mission in a way, and it's not central to what ACT was formed for or stands for. And the more they do this, the more perhaps ACT's contribution at and beyond Parliament is kind of sidelined.
Yeah, and he can, just on this specific issue as well, he can somewhat at this point as well leave it to third parties as well. We've already seen the likes of Hobson's Pledge and others, mounting pretty strong campaigns. It looks like they've got a fair amount of resource behind them. He doesn't have to personally fight that fight, to your point. He can leave that to others who support his cause and be focusing on other, core ACT things, and then also when the time comes, focus on being Deputy Prime Minister.
What you mentioned Hobson's Pledge. One quick thing on them. I was talking before about sort of a lack of decorum and maturity, perhaps, in some of the social media postings from ACT's party people, but they haven't got a mark at all on Hobson's Pledge, who put out a press release from Don Brash, a serious person in former times, with the headline on it, "Time for scaredy cat Christopher to find his furballs," about Christopher Luxon not meeting the hīkoi. I mean, this is silliness, and it's attention-seeking, but it's the sort of thing that serious people would have frowned on and said, let's move past that and get on with the debate. It's descending a bit. It needs to now, in the select committee process, have some examples of all sides listening. Be interesting to see whether some of the factual bases that academics and scholars and experts have said that David Seymour's bill is already misunderstanding and has started from the wrong point on a number of original points of premise, whether they'll accept any of those. Because the wise thing probably would say, okay, it looks like we got that wrong. Still doesn't take away from our point that now, in this context, X. But let's see.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see the calibre of that debate and of the submissions through the Select Committee. And I know that committee has already met twice to lay down some rules and parameters around how that will play out over the coming 6 months. And because you raise Christopher Luxon as well, or because Hobson's Pledge did, I think we can't not talk about his response to this. Obviously, he was not in the House or in Parliament during the first reading. He decided not to go out and meet the hīkoi. Was that the right decision? And can he keep ducking and weaving from this one? I mean, I was out among that crowd, and yes, people were talking about David Seymour, but, it was half a breath later they were talking about Christopher Luxon. Their focus is not just on this one bill. It is not just on David Seymour. It is on Christopher Luxon and how he has handled this bill, but also on broader government policy. So I think if Christopher Luxon thinks he can kind of duck and weave and avoid this one, wait till it kind of dies down, he might have another thing coming. What do you think of his response on the day, Tim, and how that's going to, I guess, be remembered or potentially impact on those on Crown Māori relations going forwards?
He was on a hiding to nothing. Had he gone out, there would have been very strong verbal reaction because, of course, his numbers as national allowed this thing to get off the ground. However, he didn't do what Helen Clark did all those years ago, and as they were walking towards Parliament, call them the haters and wreckers. So he hadn't gone out and caused offence. She didn't go and meet them either, and that was the wise thing to do then. I think if he had gone and tried to either front or speak, there would have been some regard for the gesture, and he'd have to have made a proper gesture, not just a stand and pretend like David Seymour and ACT did with their video going. Had he done so, there may have been some regard for that. I do think, though, it's a hiding to nothing. He's almost, I think, like, I've committed to this. It's going to rain on me. I'm just going to get wet for the next 6 months, and then it'll be sunny times for the next 18 going towards the election.
Welcome back to Raw Politics. I am joined now by senior political reporter Mark Dalder, but he is not sitting in my personal bubble as usual in our podcast studio. Instead, he is joining us from the other side of the world at the Global Climate Summit COP from Azerbaijan. Hi Mark, how are you?
I'm doing good. It's a lot that's going on. There are 60,000 people at COP this year, and I'm having a great time walking the kilometre and a half it is each morning from the entrance to the venue to the media centre. It is a very large undertaking.
Are you counting your steps? I feel like you need a Fitbit or
steps. I did 88,000 steps in week one. We'll see if I can beat that in week two.
My goodness, you must be exhausted. Well, thank you for joining us. I think it's very late at night your time. I'm really enjoying the swap that we've done. Of course, we did this a couple of weeks ago when I was in the US, so happy to return the favour there.
Yeah.
So you said there are 60,000 people there. Can you give us an idea of who are some of the key players and what people are hoping to achieve at this year's COP, especially for those who aren't familiar with this type of summit?
Yeah, so every year we've got the COP, the Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Change Treaty and to the Paris Agreement and to the Kyoto Protocol. It's sort of three conferences all in one. Brings together representatives from 200 different nations, but over the years you've also developed this trade show alongside civil society and academia, and that's why it's kind of ballooned in size. The last year's COP in Dubai, COP28, was the largest ever with 80-some thousand people attending. This year's is a little bit smaller, but still the second largest, and for Baku, Azerbaijan, it's a very big summit indeed. Azerbaijan is a small state on the Caspian Sea, ruled by an authoritarian government and with a main export of oil and gas, so kind of an odd place for hosting a climate summit. Maybe we can get into that if you're interested. There's some background there. The big goal this year is agreeing a new climate finance goal. Sounds a little bit dry, but it's really important because there's this kind of grand bargain that underlies the Paris Agreement and all of our international climate diplomacy, and that's we need developing countries, which make up about 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions at this stage, to reduce their emissions. But they're not going to do that if it costs them economic development, if it plunges people into poverty. And so developed countries, which have industrialized and developed on the back of fossil fuels, have an obligation to help those developing countries decarbonize.
I wanted to pick up on something that you said there around Azerbaijan, their oil and gas exports, how important that is to them, and how that has created some awkwardness, I guess, or the context in which that places this COP.
Yeah, it is a bit of a strange scenario. The president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has been making headlines first for saying oil and gas is a gift from God in his speech to the COP, and then the next day in a speech to small island states denouncing French colonialism in the Pacific, saying that France was holding political prisoners in relation to New Caledonia, basically getting back at France for its advocacy for Armenia in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict that's been a many decades in the making situation. It's not the sort of diplomacy you normally see around COPs. It's also been really frustrating for the role of the COP president, who's the Azerbaijan's Minister for Ecology. His job is to steward these negotiations through to a result that everyone can walk away happy with. He seems to be trying to take it very seriously, getting these deals done, and his president's sort of interference is not making that an easier job. But this isn't really a summit that Azerbaijan wanted to host. The summits move around to different regions every year. This is Eastern Europe's year, and the war in Ukraine meant that anyone who Russia put forward was vetoed by Ukraine's allies and vice versa. Finally, Armenia dropped its opposition to Azerbaijan hosting, and this was the only compromise that could be found.
Right, so there's a bit of controversy swirling around there, and those headlines that I imagine are detracting a lot from the core purpose, that really important negotiation around the climate financing. And I mean, we're talking about Azerbaijan there and kind of the context that they're bringing to this, but we've got a similar thing in New Zealand, haven't we? I mean, going to this COP summit, but then at the same time, this government has brought in policies like the restarting of oil and gas exploration. I wondered whether you might be able to talk a little bit about that, the context in which New Zealand comes to this year's COP and how that is being viewed as well by the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's an awkward position for New Zealand to be in, right? Because our diplomats are arguing very strenuously against representatives from various petrostates, particularly Saudi Arabia, behind closed doors, pushing for a global phase out of fossil fuels. And yet at home, we are phasing in fossil fuel production. The government is within a month of COP going to restart oil and gas exploration. It's not the sort of headline that they would have wanted to see. And just yesterday, the Climate Change Performance Index, which has been a project that comes out every year for 20 years, downgraded New Zealand 7 spots to 41st out of 63 countries, and the oil and gas ban and the repeal of that was part of the reason for New Zealand slipping down the rankings. So it's not that plus the delay to pricing agricultural emissions, the government's general backtrack on climate and environmental policies. At home, it makes a slightly awkward case for ministers and diplomats coming here. But one of the things that's been really interesting to see is how easily, to be honest, our diplomats and the climate change minister, Simon Watts, managed to thread that needle and managed to play one game at home and the other game abroad. Every country is struggling with the best way to decarbonize at home, and no one's doing it perfectly. And so while there is criticism of New Zealand, and particularly around the oil and gas ban, which just seems a little bit more, pouring fuel on the fire, as you might say, and has some maybe higher diplomatic ramifications. We're a member of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and that might have to change if we are no longer beyond oil and gas. Notwithstanding all of that, New Zealand continues to be a forceful voice for reducing emissions on a global scale and tries to be a strong advocate for the Pacific as well.
I mean, does that feel? How does that sit with you, I guess, there watching that play out? You're so used to covering this at home and watching how politicians and how this government are selling their case to the New Zealand public around things like energy security and stuff like that in terms of these new policies that you've just covered, but then go overseas and it sounds like there's quite a different narrative, or they're selling a different story to the world. I mean, what's that like for you to watch? And is it right? Is it fair for them to do that? Do you think that they need to be called out for telling one story at home and one story overseas?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I've been reflecting on while witnessing, I guess, that dichotomy. One is that it is fair to say, New Zealand, if you take out of, all 190 something countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement, is doing pretty well, right? We are lucky to have a highly renewable power system. It's not something that we did through climate policy. That was just something we lucked into. But, we have leaders who do believe in climate change, right? We saw this COP, Argentina withdrew their delegation with the president of Argentina sort of talking about maybe pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Donald Trump, of course, has been elected president of the United States and is almost certain to pull out of the Paris Agreement. While we're restarting oil and gas exploration at home, we're not one of the large petrostates, one of these big producers of fossil fuels, even like Australia across the ditch, right, which has come in ranked worse than us in that climate change performance index and is, the second largest producer of coal in the world, or exporter at least. Given that context, you go, okay, it's helpful to see New Zealand's perspective. The other thing that it gives me sort of reflection on is the Paris Agreement is non-binding. It's not something where it comes in and it requires countries to reduce their emissions by X amount or implement this policy or that policy. What it relies on is accountability from the people of that country, right? And so it highlights the importance of the job that we do as journalists, the job that civil society plays in New Zealand in pointing out those discrepancies, in identifying those areas where the government is backtracking on climate policy, particularly when official advice is saying things like, this is going to make it harder for us to meet our climate targets, this might be breaching our free trade obligations, this might be damaging our relationship with the Pacific, and we can't necessarily count on the international community to hold New Zealand to account. That's where our job comes in, and that's where we have a role to play as journalists, but also just as New Zealanders, right? That's the structure of the Paris Agreement, is that it democratizes that accountability mechanism.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about Simon Watts, our climate minister, kind of threading that needle and doing it relatively well. I mean, I wouldn't say at home that he's a very high-profile minister. I'm interested in how he's been performing overseas. Has he been, has he been more high profile? Has he had any bigger speaking slots, or has it been more kind of diplomacy on the edges and those meetings behind closed doors?
Yeah, so Simon Watts has only been here for 3 days. The ministers usually only come for week 2, but he's one of just 8 ministers who's been given a specific job by the COP president. He, along with Singapore's Grace Fu, are overseeing the carbon market negotiations, trying to get that deal to land after many, many years of effort. And it does sound like we're close to a deal. Whether you can sort of assign that just to Simon Watts' work, I think it would be fair to say that countries are really just keen to get this done. But it is something that he's picked up, and he's eager to, be able to get that notch on his belt. He's had 3 sort of public speaking slots so far. One was to deliver New Zealand's national statement, a very sort of straightforward, kind of what you'd expect. He talks up New Zealand's climate policy. He talks about the importance of the Paris Agreement in the Pacific, and he did make an announcement around a $10 million contribution to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. He also has, in this role around the carbon trading negotiations, reported back in this public plenary, saying here's where we're at in these negotiations, here's where we think we can find a compromise. That was probably more technical than anything else. His biggest, I think, moment of leadership, I suppose, is in a meeting on the first day that he was here, discussing emissions reductions and the scope of the emissions reduction sort of work program at the COP. This has been a really unexpectedly high-profile issue at the COP. We came in expecting to talk a lot about finance, but we've seen a concerted effort from countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, to block discussions of reducing emissions at the same time. Last year at COP, there was this commitment that everyone made, including the Saudis, to transition away from fossil fuels, but it sounds like there's some buyer's remorse, some buyer's regret, and that there's some backtracking being attempted there. So Simon Watts was among the developed country leaders who specifically called out, without naming names, but saying there are countries that are trying to block this, and that's extremely disappointing. And so the fact that he felt comfortable, I think, positioning himself in that role is interesting. It's what we would expect of a New Zealand minister, but I think he delivered it well.
Right. And we've spoken about the climate financing piece of work that they're trying to get out of this COP. For New Zealand specifically, I mean, what do you think we will go away with? What will we take away from this summit? And then how does that translate potentially into policy or legislation or changes at home? What should New Zealanders tangibly expect to see from this?
I think the biggest direct impact is going to be around that carbon trading, carbon markets negotiation. Once that's sorted, the onus then falls on the government to figure out how it's going to meet our Paris target. So successive governments, National Labour and National again, have committed to Paris targets which require us to buy a lot of offshore carbon credits. Once that carbon market is in place, the government actually needs to lay out a plan for how they're going to do it, how they're going to fund it, how many they're going to buy. We only have till 2030 to do it, and it's quite a lot of credits that we need to get working on. So that's, I think, from a policy perspective, the thing that I'm most interested in. The finance goal is a big picture thing, right? These sort of UN negotiations, they aren't going to put a specific obligation on New Zealand to contribute, 1% of whatever hundreds of billions or trillions of US dollars that countries commit to providing. It will just be a goal, and then countries figure out on their own basis how much they want to contribute to that. But there is an expectation that if the global goal increases, as it almost certainly will, New Zealand increases its climate finance contributions. That's tough for two reasons. One is that our current climate finance contributions are 2/3 funded from the Climate Emergency Response Fund, which was disestablished to pay for tax cuts. So just to even out and keep our current climate finance contribution flat going forward, we need to find $200 million a year extra. And then we're talking about wanting to increase it to reflect that the global goal has increased as well. That's going to be a tough ask of Finance Minister Nicola Willis in a really tight operating allowance for next year's budget. Probably you're going to have to see something cut in order to make room for that, and what exactly that looks like, that's the other question that comes out for New Zealand, particularly from this COP.
Yeah, really a lot of pressure there, especially in this fiscal environment, like you say. Thank you so much for explaining all of that, Mark. I've been really enjoying reading your coverage, and will continue to do so over the coming week. And then, of course, as you pointed out earlier, it doesn't stop here. Then it's about holding to account, checking back in on the progress and where the government is at going forwards, especially heading into next year's budget. So thanks for joining us. Our audience question for this week is, how does this hikoi compare to other protests of the past? Now, Tim, I thought maybe you could run us through some that stick in your mind and might be comparable. Of course, there have been lots, but people are calling this the biggest parliament protest in history. How do you reckon it compares?
Well, I think it is, from just obviously viewing and looking at people's calculations of numbers, but also looking back over major protests that we remember. The Springbok Tour protests, they were disparate. They were separate events across and around the country. But the total for all of those was just 150,000. That's a big number, and we had a smaller population, but 150,000 for must have been 15, 20 events. The biggest that I think I can see after this one was a rare event that came out of nowhere, really, in 1981, and it shocked all sides. It was a lunchtime event organised by a 22-year-old, and I sort of smiled a bit when I thought of that because, of course, Hannah, in Parliament, being the youngest, and she's the same age, I think, or just about. So here we had a young woman again at the centre of this. Her name was, Tanya Harris, and she organised the Kiwis Care march just out of nowhere. She was an office worker in Auckland City. This was in response to industrial action through 1981 and 1980, and she wanted people to come out and say, Kiwis care, and we want our freedom, and we want things to be back working and being serviced again. 50,000 people crammed Queen Street at lunchtime on a weekday. So lots of the people, the commuters who'd come in to work in there, joined it. The turnout for this really took the country aback, including the government of the day, Muldoon's government, that had its troubles and was facing difficulty going into the election that November. And this was in March of 1981. And it, I think, gained some real backing from this. These days they would have called the protest a bit of an astroturfing and that she was gaslighting and she had all sorts of other agendas going on. She said, for example, she was just going out for pride and unity in the country and we want our freedoms. It was not a union. She never mentioned and didn't attack unions or anything like that. It was all very done in the positive. A bit like David Seymour saying now he's wanting unity in the same way. But look, it had a huge effect. And as I say, in those days, in that population, 50,000 made a statement.
Yeah, and since we're talking about young people mobilising, the other thing that, and I feel like maybe we've forgotten about how massive it was, but the school strike for climate back in 2019, I mean, the March on Parliament here was massive. Obviously, that was overshadowed by events later in the day on the 15th of March 2019. But it wasn't just in Wellington where, you know, it was estimated that there were tens of thousands of people who marched to Parliament in Wellington, but it was also around the rest of the country. So there were some pretty significant numbers there as well. I didn't feel like that crowd had anything on the crowd that we saw earlier this week, just comparing the two, you know, being out there with those two protests. But it was also a significant march that was led by young Kiwi. Let's wrap things up with some recommendations. The best thing you have read, watched or listened to this week. Tim, what have you got for us?
Mine is from Stuff, from Tony Wall, who went to Opotiki in the Bay of Plenty to mark the gang insignia, gang patch ban law coming in by meeting there with mongrel mob members who were attending a community meeting. The thing that struck me about it was it's one of the few stories about gangs, gang rights, gang patches, crackdowns on gangs that actually talks directly to gang members. So it was worth seeing the viewpoints they bring, and it's rare.
I was just going to say as well, Tim, reading that piece, I thought about how there has been a slight shift in the reporting on gangs and how we are seeing more gang voices represented in the reporting. And, you know, however, regardless of however you feel about gangs and their views, I mean, having the different sides and the different voices in that reporting has to be a good thing. Following on in the theme of crime and law and order, my rec for this week is from the New Zealand Herald's crime reporter, Jared Savage, who did a great profile of the incoming Police Commissioner, Richard Chambers. It goes through his history, what others say about him, people who have worked with him. It talks about his ambition as well as his, I guess, vision for what the New Zealand police force should be. Really worth a read. And
it made me feel old, Laura, because I very clearly recall reporting on his father, the barrister, in courtrooms around Auckland years ago.
That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you so much to our producer, Dave Filoi-Ali'i, and our readers, listeners and viewers. If you have any burning questions or some feedback that you'd like to fire through, send it to me. My email address is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.